Welcome back. Tonight, we're settling into something that has puzzled, frustrated, and fascinated the Five Nights at Freddy's community for nearly a decade. This is a story about two moments in time, separated by just 4 years, yet bound together by mechanical jaws, shattered innocence, and consequences that would echo through every corner of this haunted franchise. Two incidents that have sparked countless debates, launched innumerable theory videos, and kept fans awake long past midnight trying to piece together exactly what happened in those dark corners of Fazbear Entertainment's troubled history. The smell of pizza grease hanging in recycled air, the cheerful jingle of arcade machines drowning out the whir of animatronic servos, and children's birthday parties, where paper hats and streamers provided bright colors against the industrial gray of kitchen equipment, visible through service windows. This was the world of Fredbear's Family Diner and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, places designed for joy that would become synonymous with horror. And at the center of that transformation from wonder to nightmare stand two pivotal moments, the bite of 83 and the bite of 87. These weren't just accidents. They weren't simple mechanical failures or unfortunate coincidences. They were the inevitable results of dangerous technology, corporate negligence, family dysfunction, and perhaps supernatural forces that no amount of engineering could have anticipated. They represent the moments when the illusion shattered completely, and when the animatronics stopped being entertainers and became something far more dangerous. And understanding them means understanding the very foundation of Five Nights at Freddy's itself. Tonight, we're going to explore every facet of both incidents. We'll trace the development of the technology that made them possible, the spring-lock suits whose innovative design carried lethal potential. We'll examine the families torn apart by these tragedies, particularly the Aftons, whose dysfunction would leave scars across multiple generations. We'll analyze the evidence that eventually resolved the great 83 versus 87 debate that consumed the community for years. And we'll consider what these incidents mean for the broader narrative of a franchise that has captivated millions. So settle in. Let the night settle around you like a comfortable blanket. Whether you're drifting towards sleep or simply seeking to understand these complex events more deeply, this exploration will take you through every shadow and secret of two incidents that changed everything. Let's begin at the very beginning, in the era before the haunted hallways and possessed animatronics, when two ambitious entrepreneurs first dreamed of bringing mechanical characters to life. Two incidents, separated by just 4 years, yet bound together by mechanical jaws, shattered innocence, and consequences that would ripple through every corner of this haunted franchise. The bite of 83 and the bite of 87. Two moments where metal met flesh, where childhood wonder transformed into lasting horror, and where the dark heart of Fazbear Entertainment revealed itself in the most visceral way imaginable. For years, and these two events existed in a fog of confusion. When Five Nights at Freddy's 4 released in 2015, players witnessed what appeared to be the infamous bite of 87 that Phone Guy had cryptically mentioned in the very first game. But something didn't add up. A television screen flickered with the year 1983, and suddenly everything we thought we knew was thrown into question. Were there two bites? Was Scott Cawthon, the creator of this labyrinthine horror series, playing tricks on us? Or had we simply missed something fundamental about the timeline we thought we understood? Tonight, we're going to untangle every thread of both incidents. We'll walk through the origins of the technology that made these tragedies possible, the springlock suits that blurred the line between costume and machine in ways that would prove catastrophic. I will meet the families torn apart by these events, particularly the Aftons, whose dysfunction and darkness would leave scars across multiple generations. We'll examine every piece of evidence, every phone call recording, every minigame pixel that has helped the community piece together what really happened on those fateful days. The bite of 83 took the life of a child. The bite of 87 left its victim alive, but forever changed, missing a piece of their brain, yet somehow surviving. One occurred at the humble origins of this cursed franchise, at Fredbear's family diner, where golden animatronics first sang for wide-eyed children. The other struck at a grander establishment, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, during its attempted renaissance in 1987, when new toy animatronics with facial recognition technology were supposed to represent a safer, a more modern approach to family entertainment. Both bites share something essential. They represent moments where the illusion shattered completely. The animatronics weren't just entertainers anymore. They were dangers, unpredictable forces that could turn on the very people they were designed to delight. And in understanding these two pivotal moments, we begin to understand why the nights at Freddy's became so frightening, why security guards were needed at all, and why the shadows of these pizza parlors hide so much more than outdated equipment and faded party decorations. So settle in. Let the ambient sounds of the night wash over you, and let's trace the complete history of these two bites that changed everything. Whether you're encountering these stories for the first time or revisiting them like old friends, and there's always something new to discover in the depths of Five Nights at Freddy's lore. This is a tale of innovation gone wrong, of family tragedy, of corporate negligence, and of mechanical marvels that became instruments of lasting trauma. Let's begin at the very beginning, where the seeds of both catastrophes were first planted. The origins, Fazbear Entertainment, and the dangerous promise of springlock technology. To understand how either bite became possible, we need to travel back to the foundations of Fazbear Entertainment itself, to a time before the haunted hallways and possessed animatronics, when two men with very different visions came together to create something they believed would bring joy to families. Henry Emily and William Afton were partners, co-founders of what would eventually become one of the most troubled entertainment companies in fictional history. Their collaboration began with a shared dream of animatronic entertainment, of bringing mechanical characters to life in ways that would captivate children and create lasting memories. Henry Emily was the inventor, the creative genius whose engineering brilliance gave birth to the animatronics themselves. He designed the circuits and servos, the facial recognition systems and voice modulators that would make characters like Fredbear and later Freddy Fazbear seem almost alive. His motivations appeared pure, driven by a genuine desire to create wonder. He had a family he loved, including his daughter Charlotte, and his work seemed to flow from that same wellspring of affection for childhood innocence. William Afton was different. He handled the business side of things, the contracts and negotiations and strategic decisions that would determine the company's growth. But beneath his professional exterior lurked something far more troubling, a darkness that would eventually consume not only himself, but everyone around him. While Henry built machines to delight, William would eventually twist that same technology toward far more sinister purposes. Their first major collaboration was Fredbear's Family Diner, a modest establishment that introduced the world to Fredbear himself, a golden bear animatronic whose cheerful demeanor and catchy songs quickly made him a local favorite. Alongside Fredbear performed Spring Bonnie, a golden rabbit who served as his companion on stage. These two characters would become iconic, not for their entertainment value alone, but for the revolutionary and ultimately dangerous technology that powered them. The Springlock suits represented something genuinely innovative in animatronic design. Unlike traditional animatronics that could only function as robots, or traditional costumes that were simply hollow suits worn by performers, Springlock technology allowed the same physical shell to serve both purposes. Through a complex system of internal mechanisms, the animatronic components could be compressed against the walls of the suit using special cranks and locks, creating enough space for a human performer to climb inside and wear it as a costume. When the performer was done, the locks could be released, and the animatronic parts would spring back into position, allowing the character to function autonomously once again. On paper, this seemed brilliant. It meant fewer suits were needed. Performers could seamlessly transition between costume work and letting the robots handle things, and the characters would always look consistent whether operated by a person or their mechanical systems. The technology impressed everyone who witnessed it, and for a while, it seemed like the future of animatronic entertainment had arrived. But the Springlock suites harbored a terrible secret, one that would claim lives and leave lasting trauma. The same mechanisms that allowed them to compress and expand were incredibly sensitive, prone to failure under the wrong conditions. Moisture was the primary enemy. A single drop of water, a bead of sweat, even the humidity of someone's breath in an enclosed space could cause the Springlocks to slip. When they failed, the compressed animatronic parts would snap back into their default positions with tremendous force. And if a person was inside the suit when this happened, those metal components would pierce through flesh and bone with brutal efficiency. Phone Guy, the helpful voice who would later guide night guards through their shifts at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, recorded training tapes that described the Springlock failure process in clinical detail. The Springlocks would release, cutting into every part of the wearer's body. The mechanisms would then attempt to move back into place, slowly crushing the victim, while metal pierced their organs. Death was rarely quick. Victims would bleed internally, their lungs filling with blood, as the animatronic parts continued their mechanical movements, indifferent to the human trapped within. Despite these dangers, Fazbear Entertainment continued using Springlock suits for years. Employees were trained to wind the mechanisms tightly, to avoid moisture at all costs, and to remain calm if they felt a lock beginning to slip. The training tapes emphasized that if a failure seemed imminent, the wearer should move away from populated areas and find a suitable place to quietly expire, so as not to disturb the customers. The callousness of this instruction speaks volumes about the company's priorities, where public relations consistently outweighed employee safety. At Fredbear's Family Diner, both Fredbear and Spring Bonnie utilized this Springlock technology. They would perform on stage as animatronics during busy periods, their mechanical systems handling the songs and movements. But during special events, birthday parties, or when a more personal touch was needed, employees would climb into the suits and become the characters themselves, interacting directly with children in ways that pure robots could not. This hybrid existence created an inherent instability. The suits were never quite one thing or the other. They occupied a liminal space between machine and costume, between autonomous performer and human vessel. And in that ambiguity lay the potential for catastrophe. The animatronics weren't just props to be maintained. They were complex systems with multiple failure points, any one of which could transform a joyful performance into a scene of unimaginable horror. Henry Emily, despite his technical brilliance, seemed blind to how his creations might be misused, or how their inherent dangers might manifest under real-world conditions. William Afton, meanwhile, grew increasingly fascinated by the darker possibilities. The animatronics could hurt people, could even kill them. And for William, whose mind was already turning toward violence and obsession, this capability held a terrible appeal. The partnership between Henry and William would eventually fracture completely, torn apart by tragedy and revelation. But in these early days, they worked side by side, building the empire that would spawn Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, Circus Baby's Pizza World, and countless other locations where children would gather to celebrate, unaware of the shadows lurking behind the cheerful facades. As Fredbear's Family Diner grew in popularity, expansion became inevitable. The success of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie inspired the creation of new characters. Freddy Fazbear, a brown bear who would become the face of the franchise. Bonnie, a purple rabbit with a guitar. Chica, a yellow chicken who loved pizza. And Foxy, a pirate fox who would develop his own devoted following. These characters would eventually get their own stages, their own restaurants, their own devoted fans. But the Springlock suits remained at the heart of the operation, at least initially. The newer animatronics would move away from Springlock technology, using more conventional and safer designs. Yet Fredbear and Spring Bonnie continued to perform in their original configurations, dangerous relics from an earlier era that stubbornly persisted, even as the company evolved around them. This is the world into which the Afton family was born, a world of animatronic wonder and corporate negligence, of mechanical marvels and hidden dangers. William Afton raised his children in the shadow of these creations, brought them to the restaurants he co-owned, let them interact with machines that could bring both joy and devastation. His oldest son, Michael, would grow into a bully with his father's cruel streak. His daughter, Elizabeth, would develop a fatal fascination with the animatronics themselves. And his youngest, the child who would come to be known as the crying child, would live in constant terror of the mechanical performers that surrounded his family's life. The stage was set. The technology was in place. The family dynamics had calcified into patterns of abuse and neglect. All that remained was the spark that would ignite the tragedy, and that spark would come on a birthday that no one involved would ever forget. The Afton family, a legacy of trauma. Before we can fully understand the Bite of 83, we need to understand the family at its center. The Aftons represent one of the most dysfunctional and tragic households in gaming history. A family whose internal conflicts would spiral outward to affect countless innocent lives. At the head of this family stood William Afton, father of 3 and co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, a man whose descent into darkness would leave permanent scars on everyone he touched. William's relationship with his children was complicated at best, abusive at worst. He was a man consumed by his work, by his obsessions, and increasingly by his fascination with death and the possibility of life after it. The animatronics weren't just business ventures to William. They were experiments in tools for understanding how consciousness might persist beyond the death of the body. This obsession would eventually lead him to commit unspeakable acts, to murder children, and study how their spirits might bind to mechanical forms. But even before William became the serial killer known as the Purple Guy, his household was troubled. He was absent emotionally when present, and often absent physically as well, leaving his children to navigate their own complicated relationships with minimal parental guidance. The elder son, Michael, grew into a teenager with a mean streak, someone who found pleasure in tormenting others, particularly his younger siblings. Michael Afton would eventually become a protagonist in later games, seeking redemption for his family's sins. But in 1983, he was simply a bully, a young man who had internalized his father's coldness and learned to channel his own frustrations into cruelty. He had friends who shared his disposition, teenagers who wore masks of the Fazbear animatronics and used them to frighten and torment the vulnerable. Elizabeth Afton, the middle child, was drawn to her father's creations with an innocent fascination that would prove fatal. She was particularly captivated by Cirqua's Baby, an animatronic designed by her father for a new venture called Circus Baby's Pizza World. Elizabeth didn't know that Circus Baby had been designed with sinister capabilities, equipped with a claw mechanism in her torso, meant to capture children under the guise of dispensing ice cream. Despite William's warnings to stay away from Baby, Elizabeth couldn't resist the animatronic's allure. She would eventually become one of Baby's victims, her spirit possessing the machine that killed her. But it is the youngest Afton child who concerns us most in the story of the Bite of 83. Known to the community as the Crying Child, this young boy has never been given a definitive name in the official games, though fans have speculated about various possibilities. Some believe the Survival Logbook, an official FNAF publication, contains hidden clues suggesting his name might be Evan. Others have proposed names like Chris or Norman, based on different interpretations of various hints scattered throughout the franchise. Whatever his true name, his defining characteristic was obvious: fear. The Crying Child was terrified of the animatronics. While other children saw Fredbear and Spring Bonnie as friendly performers, as sources of entertainment and delight, the Crying Child saw only monsters. His fear wasn't entirely irrational. He had witnessed things that other children hadn't, glimpses of the darker side of his father's business. Some theorists believe he may have seen his father committing crimes while wearing the Spring Bonnie suit, witnessing murders that his young mind couldn't fully process, but which left lasting psychological scars. The evidence for this interpretation comes from the minigames of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, where we see the Crying Child's daily life in the days leading up to his birthday. He's constantly watched, constantly afraid. Plush versions of the animatronics appear throughout his house. Some theorists suggest these were actually monitoring devices planted by William to keep tabs on his son. The Fredbear plush, in particular, seems to communicate with the child, offering cryptic warnings and promises that add to his sense of unease rather than comfort. The Crying Child's room reflects his mental state. It's sparse, somewhat institutional, lacking the warmth you'd expect in a young child's bedroom. He doesn't have the normal accoutrements of childhood. Instead, he has his plushies, his fears, and his older brother's constant torment. Michael made the Crying Child's life a waking nightmare long before the bite occurred. He would hide in closets and behind doors, leaping out wearing his foxy mask to terrify his younger sibling. He recruited his friends to join in, surrounding the Crying Child with masked figures representing Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, mocking him for his tears and his terror. These weren't isolated incidents, but a sustained campaign of psychological abuse that pushed the younger boy further and further into his shell of fear. The mini-games show us moments from this campaign. The Crying Child locked in a room, crying on the floor. The Crying Child cornered at Fredbear's family diner by his brother and his friends, their masked faces looming over him as he weeps. Each interaction reinforced his trauma, deepened his association between the animatronics and danger, and set the stage for the catastrophe to come. What makes this dynamic particularly tragic is the ambiguity around Michael's motivations. Was he simply cruel, taking pleasure in his brother's suffering? Or was there something more complicated going on, and perhaps his own attempt to toughen up his sibling in a household where weakness was clearly not tolerated? The games don't provide definitive answers, but they do show that Michael would eventually come to deeply regret his actions, spending years trying to atone for sins committed as a teenager. The household's dysfunction extended beyond sibling relationships. William's absences, both physical and emotional, left all three children lacking proper guidance. The mother figure in the Afton family is notably absent from most game content, with various theories suggesting she may have left the family, died, or simply been edited out of the narrative for simplicity. Whatever the case, there was no stabilizing presence in the Afton home, and no one to intervene in Michael's bullying or to address the crying child's clearly pathological level of fear. This family context transforms the bite of 83 from a simple accident into something more complex. It wasn't just a mechanical failure or an unfortunate coincidence. It was the inevitable result of toxic family dynamics intersecting with dangerous technology. The crying child's birthday was supposed to be a celebration, a day when even the most troubled family might come together in joy. Instead, it became the culmination of years of torment, a moment when Michael's cruelty and the inherent dangers of Fredbear's design combined to create a tragedy. Understanding the Afton family also helps explain why the aftermath of the bite would ripple through the franchise so profoundly. A William's response to losing his youngest child further warped his already damaged psyche, contributing to his descent into serial murder. Michael's guilt over causing his brother's death would define the rest of his life, driving him to seek redemption in increasingly dangerous ways. Even Elizabeth's fate with Circus Baby takes on additional weight when viewed in the context of a family that had already lost one child to their father's creations. The crying child didn't just die in the bite of 83. He became a symbol, a representation of innocence destroyed by forces beyond its control or understanding. His tears weren't just expressions of childish fear. They were warnings that went unheeded, cries for help in a family and a company that had no interest in providing it. And when Fredbear's jaws closed around his head, and those tears finally had a reason that no one could dismiss or mock. The bite of 83, a complete account. The events leading up to the bite of 83 unfold across the minigames of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, giving us a window into the final days of the crying child's short life. While these sequences are rendered in simple pixel graphics, their emotional impact is profound, depicting a child trapped in a cycle of fear and abuse that builds inexorably toward catastrophe. The week begins with the crying child locked in his bedroom, crying on the floor near the door, the toys in his room, plush versions of the animatronics, watch silently as he weeps. His brother has locked him in, a cruel punishment for some unknown transgression, or perhaps just because Michael found it amusing. This is the child's daily existence, a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by reminders of the things he fears most. When the crying child finally escapes his room, we see glimpses of his world. There's a television playing Fredbear and Friends, 1983, a show featuring Fredbear alongside Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. This seemingly innocent detail would later become crucial evidence in dating these events. The 1983 clearly displayed on screen, serving as confirmation that we were not, in fact, witnessing the bite of 87 as many initially assumed. The crying child's movements are limited, his world confined to the spaces between his home and Fredbear's family diner. We see him outside his house, where neighborhood children play with toys that represent the animatronics. We see him near the diner itself, where he sometimes locks up with fear, unable to approach the establishment that fills him with such dread. Throughout these days, the Fredbear plush communicates with the child in cryptic ways. The messages appear in text, suggesting either that the plush actually speaks, or that these are thoughts the child imagines coming from his only companion. The plush warns him about things, tells him that someone put him back together, offers commentary that seems to reference events beyond the child's understanding. Some theorists believe William was using the plush as a monitoring device, watching his son through its camera eyes and perhaps speaking to him through a hidden speaker. Others interpret the plush as a manifestation of the child's deteriorating mental state, an imaginary friend that reflects his fears back at him. The relationship between the crying child and the Fredbear himself is particularly complex. Despite fearing the animatronics, the boy seems drawn to Fredbear in particular. His plush is his most treasured possession, a soft comfort version of the metal monster that terrifies him in the flesh. This duality, the way a child can simultaneously love and fear something, is one of the most psychologically realistic elements of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. As the birthday approaches, we see the crying child venturing closer to Fredbear's family diner. He witnesses things that disturb him, moments that the games leave partially obscured. He sees employees in the springlock suits, including someone who may be his father, helping another person into a spring bonnie costume. He sees glimpses of back rooms where things that children shouldn't see might be happening. Each observation adds to his fear, reinforcing his sense that something deeply wrong lurks behind the diner's cheerful facade. The cruelty of his brother and friends continues throughout the week. They corner him at the diner, mocking his tears and his obvious terror. They chase him, surround him, make his life a constant flight from harassment. And throughout it all, the plush keeps speaking, keeps warning, keeps promising that it will put him back together, though what this means remains unclear. The birthday party itself takes place at Fredbear's family diner. The crying child doesn't want to be there. Every moment spent in proximity to the animatronics is torture for him, the mechanical performers representing everything he fears. But birthdays are unavoidable, and so he finds himself at the center of a celebration he cannot enjoy, surrounded by children who don't understand his terror and an older brother who sees his fear as an opportunity. Michael and his friends, wearing their animatronic masks, approach the crying child as the party continues around them. They mock him, calling him a crybaby, laughing at his obvious distress. The confrontation escalates, the bullies feeding off each other's cruelty, and what begins as verbal mockery transforms into something physical. The final minigame shows us exactly what happened. The bullies lift the crying child, carrying him toward the stage where Fredbear stands in animatronic mode, his golden fur gleaming under the party lights. The child struggles, crying, begging to be put down, but his protestations only make his tormentors laugh harder. To them, this is the ultimate prank. They're going to give the birthday boy a kiss from his favorite character, force an intimate confrontation with the thing he fears most. They thrust the crying child's head into Fredbear's open mouth. The animatronic's jaws are wide, designed to open and close as part of his singing animations. For one terrible moment, the child is suspended there, his head inside the mechanical maw of the golden bear, surrounded by the laughter of bullies who don't understand the danger of what they're doing. And then Fredbear bites down. The exact cause of the bite has been debated extensively. Some believe it was a spring lock failure, that the crying child's tears provided the moisture necessary to trip the delicate mechanisms. Others point out that Fredbear was in animatronic mode at the time, meaning the spring locks weren't engaged at all. The more likely explanation is that Fredbear's jaw mechanism simply activated, either on a programmed cycle or triggered by the sudden addition of weight as the child's head entered his mouth. Whatever the mechanical cause, the result was catastrophic. Fredbear's jaws closed with tremendous force, crushing the crying child's skull. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by screams of horror as the children and adults present witnessed something no party should ever contain. The bullies released their grip, but it was far too late. The damage was done in an instant, a mechanical movement that couldn't be undone. The aftermath is shown in brief, haunting glimpses. The crying child lies in what appears to be a hospital bed, IVs and pills visible in the background. He's alive technically, but barely. His brother Michael appears at his bedside, apologizing, promising that he didn't mean for this to happen, that it was just supposed to be a joke. The regret in Michael's pixelated form is palpable, the first crack in his cruel exterior that would eventually lead to his quest for redemption. The Fredbear plush speaks one final time, "I will put you back together." And then the child is gone. The flat line of a heart monitor isn't shown, but its presence is implied. The crying child dies from his injuries, another casualty of the Afton family's dysfunction and Fazbear Entertainment's dangerous technology. The Bite of 83 wasn't a public event like the Bite of 87 would later become. It didn't make headlines or directly lead to policy changes in the same visible way. But its impact on the Afton family was profound. Michael would carry the guilt of killing his brother for the rest of his life, eventually dedicating himself to undoing the damage his family had caused. William's already damaged psyche took another blow, pushing him further toward the obsession with death and resurrection that would define his later crimes. And the crying child himself, his spirit perhaps lingering in some form, became part of the complicated supernatural ecosystem that pervades the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. What makes the Bite of 83 particularly tragic is its preventability. If Michael hadn't been a bully, if William had been a better father, if the animatronics had been designed with better safety features, if anyone had paid attention to the crying child's obvious terror and gotten him help, this could have been avoided. Instead, every failing aligned perfectly. Every bad decision and neglected responsibility contributed to a single moment of irreversible horror. The birthday boy never got to enjoy his birthday. The candles were never blown out, the wishes never made. In place of celebration, there was only metal and blood, and a child's life ending before it had truly begun. The Great Debate, 1983 versus 1987. When Five Nights at Freddy's 4 released in July 2015, the community was electric with anticipation. The Bite of 87 had been mentioned in the very first game, a tantalizing piece of lore that Phone Guy referenced almost casually during his Night 1 call. The animatronics used to walk around during the day, he explained, but then there was the Bite of 87. The implication was clear. Something terrible had happened, something so severe that the animatronics' freedom had been permanently restricted. And fans had been theorizing about this incident ever since. The fourth game seemed perfectly positioned to finally reveal the truth. The marketing heavily featured the number 87, with teaser images containing those digits hidden in the artwork. Nightmare Foxy's teaser famously had 87 embedded in his eye, which fans even discovered could be translated into coordinates pointing to an actual Virginia pizzeria. Everything suggested that we were about to witness the legendary bite of 87 in all its terrible glory. And then the game released, and everything became confusing. The minigames clearly depicted a bite. There was no ambiguity about that. We watched Fredbear's jaws close on a child's head, saw the aftermath of a tragic injury, but a detail that many players initially overlooked would soon tear the community apart. A television screen in one of the minigames displayed Fredbear and Friends, 1983. At first, many dismissed this as merely the copyright date of the show being depicted, similar to how a TV today might display an old program with its original air date. The game had to be showing the bite of 87, they argued. Everything in the marketing pointed to it. Scott Cawthon wouldn't build up expectations so thoroughly, only to subvert them with a different bite entirely. But as more players examined the evidence, doubts grew. The establishment shown in the minigames was clearly Fredbear's family diner, not the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that existed in 1987, and the only animatronics visible were Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, the original Springlock duo, not the toy animatronics that were operational in the 1987 location. The victim was a child, and a young one at that, while the hints in FNAF2 suggested the Bite of 87 victim was likely an adult employee. The community fractured into two camps. The 87s maintained that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 depicted the famous bite, that the 1983 date was a red herring or referred to something other than the current year. The 83s argued that we were witnessing a different event entirely, a previously unknown incident that occurred 4 years before the bite that Phone Guy described. The debate grew intense. Forum threads stretched for hundreds of pages as fans presented evidence and counter-arguments. YouTubers made video after video, each claiming to have definitively proven one side or the other. MatPat of Game Theory tackled the question in a series of videos that attracted millions of views, but failed to settle the matter conclusively. Scott Cawthon watched all of this unfold, occasionally dropping cryptic hints but never outright confirming either position. Then came Five Nights at Freddy's, sister location in October 2016, and with it, a pivotal piece of evidence. The game included a secret room accessible through a particular sequence of events, and in this room was a keypad. Players discovered that entering the code 1983 on this keypad would cause nearby monitors to display footage of a bedroom that unmistakably matched the crying child's room from a FNAF 4's night sequences. The implication was clear. The events of FNAF 4, including the bite depicted in the minigames, occurred in 1983. The bedroom was being monitored, possibly by William Afton himself, and the surveillance footage dated the setting definitively. Still, some held out. Perhaps the bedroom existed in both eras. Perhaps the code had a different meaning. The debate continued, though momentum had clearly shifted toward the 83 interpretation. The final nail in the coffin came from Scott Cawthon himself. In November 2017, Scott made a post on Reddit addressing various fan theories, confirming that Game Theory's interpretation of key plot points was correct. Among these confirmations was the acknowledgement that FNAF 4 took place in 1983, and that the bite shown in its minigames was indeed a different incident from the bite of 87. The community had been right to question, right to dig deeper, and there were two bites. The bite of 83 claimed the life of the crying child at Fredbear's family diner. The bite of 87 occurred 4 years later at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, involved different animatronics and a different victim, and had different consequences for the franchise's lore. The resolution of this debate highlights something fundamental about Five Nights at Freddy's as a narrative experience. Scott Cawthon constructed a story that rewards careful attention and punishes assumptions. Players who took the marketing at face value, who assumed that references to 87 meant we would witness that specific incident, missed the clues pointing to an earlier tragedy. Those who scrutinized every detail, who questioned why a television would display 1983 if the events occurred in 1987, eventually arrived at the truth. The 83 versus 87 debate also demonstrates the power of community investigation in interpreting complex lore. No single player could have pieced together all the evidence. It required hundreds of theorists sharing observations, challenging each other's assumptions, and collectively working through the puzzle. The answer emerged from collaboration, from the kind of distributed analysis that only passionate fan communities can sustain. But the resolution also raised new questions. If the bite in FNAF 4 was the bite of 83, then what actually happened in the bite of 87? Who was the victim? Which animatronic was responsible? Scott had confirmed that there were two bites, but hadn't provided equal detail about both. The community still had work to do. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, 1987, setting the stage. To understand the bite of 87, we need to understand the establishment where it occurred. By 1987, Fazbear Entertainment had evolved significantly from its Fredbear's family diner origins. The company had expanded, creating larger restaurants with more animatronics and more elaborate entertainment offerings. The location operational in 1987, depicted in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, represented the company's most ambitious attempt yet at a successful family entertainment venue. This new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza featured two sets of animatronics. In the parts and service room, kept away from customers, sat the withered animatronics, Withered Freddy, Withered Bonnie, Withered Chica, and Withered Foxy. These were older models, damaged and decrepit, their exteriors torn and their mechanisms failing. They had come from a previous location, one that had been shut down under unclear circumstances, and they were being kept around primarily for their parts. The stars of the 1987 location were the toy animatronics, Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, and the Mangle. These were new designs, sleeker and more modern than their predecessors. Their plastic shells gleamed under the restaurant lights. Their movements were smoother, their performances more sophisticated, and most importantly, they came equipped with facial recognition technology, advanced systems that could identify individuals and, theoretically, keep track of any threats to the establishment. The facial recognition was presented as a safety feature. The animatronics were connected to a criminal database, able to identify anyone whose face appeared in police records, and the idea was that potential predators could be detected before they had a chance to harm any children. It was a forward-thinking concept, especially for 1987, and it suggested that Fazbear Entertainment was finally taking security seriously. The Mangle deserves special attention here, as this animatronic would become a prime suspect in the bite of 87. Originally designed as Toy Foxy, this animatronic was meant to perform in the Kids Cove area of the restaurant. However, The children proved too rough with the character, and staff grew tired of constantly repairing the damage. Eventually, management gave up, leaving the animatronic in its broken state and rebranding it as a take-apart and put-back-together attraction. The children could play with its parts however they wanted. The result was a twisted amalgamation of animatronic components. The Mangle's original form was lost beneath layers of damage and haphazard reassembly by untrained young hands. Its second head, whether an original design feature or a result of the children's modifications, added to its disturbing appearance. And crucially, its jaw mechanism remained functional despite everything else being in disarray. The 1987 location also featured the puppet, a slender marionette-like figure who resided in a prize corner, emerging from a gift box when not performing. The puppet represented something different from the other animatronics. It moved with an eerie grace, its mask-like face betraying no emotion. Unknown to most, the puppet was possessed by the spirit of Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter, who had been murdered by William Afton years earlier, and the puppet had taken on the role of protector, though its methods were imperfect at best. Running this establishment was a challenge, as the phone calls from the game made clear. The animatronics were behaving strangely, particularly toward adult staff members. They would stare at employees with unsettling intensity, their facial recognition systems seemingly unable to process adult faces correctly. Toward children, they behaved normally, entertaining and interacting with apparent warmth. But around the staff, something was clearly wrong. The night shift became particularly dangerous. The animatronics' free roaming mode, designed to keep their servos from locking up, caused them to wander the building after hours. Night security guards had to monitor their movements, keeping the robots at bay while alone in the darkened restaurant, and the position had high turnover, as employees quickly discovered that the job was far more dangerous than the low pay suggested. Jeremy Fitzgerald was one of these night guards. He took the position without fully understanding what he was getting into, and quickly learned that survival required constant vigilance. The phone calls he received from his predecessor, given the fan nickname Phone Guy, provided crucial guidance about the animatronic's behavior and weaknesses. The flashlight, the Freddy Fazbear mask that could fool the animatronic's facial recognition, the careful monitoring of vents and hallways. All of these techniques kept Jeremy alive through increasingly difficult nights. The situation at the restaurant deteriorated as the week progressed. The animatronics grew more aggressive. Someone tampered with them, reprogramming their systems in ways that made them even more dangerous. Phone Guy mentioned that a previous employee had been caught using one of the older yellow suits, the Spring Bonnie costume from the Fredbear era, for unclear purposes. The implication was that William Afton had returned, possibly committing new atrocities while disguised as a friendly character. By the end of Jeremy's shifts, the situation had become untenable. The restaurant was closing down, whether temporarily or permanently. But there was one more event scheduled, a birthday party, to be held during the day with Jeremy working the day shift to keep an eye on things. Make sure they don't hurt anyone, Phone Guy instructed. Stay close to the animatronics. It was advice that would prove tragically ironic. The Bite of 87, a complete account. Unlike the Bite of 83, which we witnessed directly through the minigames of FNAF 4, the Bite of 87 occurs off-screen. We learn about it primarily through references and implications, piecing together what happened from scattered evidence across multiple games. This makes it simultaneously more mysterious and more frustrating to analyze. A pivotal event in Five Nights at Freddy's lore that we've never actually seen depicted. Phone Guy first mentions the bite of 87 during his Night 1 call in the original Five Nights at Freddy's. His tone is almost casual, the way someone might reference a well-known incident that needs no elaboration. The animatronics used to walk around during the day, he explains. But then there was the bite of 87. Amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe, he adds, a detail that sounds almost admiring. This brief reference tells us several key facts. The bite occurred in 1987. It happened during the day, which is why the animatronics' daytime free roaming was subsequently restricted. The victim survived, though they lost their frontal lobe in the process. Phone Guy seems to find this survival remarkable, suggesting the injury was severe enough that death would have been expected. F2 provides additional context by showing us the 1987 location in detail. The game takes place in November 1987, with Jeremy Fitzgerald working the night shift before being moved to days. The paycheck Jeremy receives dates the game precisely, confirming the timeline. And the phone calls set up the incident that's about to occur. On night 6, the Phone Guy informs Jeremy that there's one more event scheduled, a birthday party the next day. Jeremy is being moved to the day shift to work this party, keeping an eye on the animatronics and making sure they don't hurt anyone. The restaurant is closing afterward, but this final event needs to happen. The implications are clear. The bite of 87 occurs at this birthday party, the day after FNAF 2's Night 6. Jeremy is present, possibly as the victim. An animatronic attacks, removing the frontal lobe of someone in attendance. The restaurant closes, and the animatronic's daytime freedom is permanently revoked. The most widely accepted theory identifies Jeremy Fitzgerald himself as the victim. He was instructed to stay close to the animatronics, putting him in harm's way. The animatronics had been behaving aggressively toward adults, and Jeremy was an adult. After Night 6, Jeremy disappears from the game. On Night 7, we play as a different character, Fritz Smith, who is fired after a single shift for tampering with the animatronics. If Jeremy was fine, why wasn't he working Night 7? Recent additions to the lore have strengthened the Jeremy theory. According to information from the week before, a more recent FNAF game, the bite victim was unable to speak after the incident. This aligns with frontal lobe damage, which can affect speech and communication. The details continue to point toward Jeremy as the unfortunate recipient of an animatronic's jaws. The location of the bite matters significantly. The frontal lobe sits at the front of the brain, just behind the forehead. For an animatronic to remove someone's frontal lobe, and it would need to bite the front of their head, the face, or forehead area. This rules out certain attack angles and suggests specific culprits. The Mangles jump scare animation in FNAF 2 shows the animatronic swinging down from above, its jaws open and aimed at the player's face. This attack angle is perfect for frontal lobe removal. The Mangle was also one of the few animatronics active in areas where customers would be present, making it a viable candidate for a daytime attack. Other toy animatronics are also suspects. Toy Chica removes her beak during gameplay, a detail that Scott Cawthon once cryptically referenced by asking why the tiny Toy Chica in FNAF 4's minigames would be missing her beak. Some interpret this as a hint that Toy Chica committed the bite, losing or removing her beak in the process. So a line from Toy Chica in Ultimate Custom Night seems to support this. "Where's my beak?" "Lodged in your forehead, of course." The withered animatronics, despite being in storage, can't be entirely ruled out. If they escaped the parts and service room during the chaos of a birthday party, they could have attacked. However, their presumed inactivity and distance from the party area makes them less likely culprits. What motivated the attack remains unclear. The animatronics had been behaving strangely for days, possibly due to tampering, possibly due to supernatural influences. They exhibited hostility toward adults while remaining friendly to children. If the victim was an adult, this pattern explains the targeting. If the victim was a child, something else was at play. Some theories suggest that William Afton was responsible for the bite, not as the victim, but as the instigator. He had been seen using a yellow suit at the location, and his presence might have agitated the possessed animatronics. The spirits within the machines might have been trying to attack him, but struck the wrong target. Alternatively, Afton might have deliberately triggered an attack on someone else, using the chaos to cover his own activities. The aftermath of the bite of 87 was significant. The restaurant closed, ending Fazbear Entertainment's attempt at a 1987 revival. The toy animatronics were scrapped, their plastic bodies dismantled and discarded. The withered animatronics were apparently preserved, eventually being refurbished for the location we see in the original FNAF game. And the policy change Phone Guy mentions, restricting animatronic movement to nighttime hours, and became standard across all future Fazbear locations. The victim's fate is somewhat ambiguous. Phone Guy expresses amazement that someone could live without their frontal lobe, suggesting the victim survived at least initially. Whether they lived for years afterward or succumbed to complications later, we don't know. If Jeremy was the victim, he doesn't appear in subsequent games in any meaningful capacity, his story ending with that fateful party. The bite of 87 represents a turning point for Fazbear Entertainment. After this incident, the company could no longer pretend that their animatronics were simply harmless entertainers. The public had seen what these machines could do. Insurance costs skyrocketed, safety regulations tightened, and the already troubled company faced a crisis of confidence that would define its future operations. And who committed the bite of 87? Theories and evidence. The identity of the animatronic responsible for the bite of 87 remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Five Nights at Freddy's. While we have strong candidates and compelling evidence, Scott Cawthon has never definitively confirmed which mechanical performer removed someone's frontal lobe on that fateful day. Let's examine each suspect in detail, weighing the evidence for and against their involvement. The Mangle emerges as the leading suspect for multiple compelling reasons. First, consider the attack pattern. In FNAF 2, the Mangle attacks by swinging down from the ceiling, jaws open wide, aiming directly at the player's face. This is precisely the angle needed to bite someone's frontal lobe. The Mangle's broken, twisted form gives it an unsettling appearance, but more importantly, its jaw mechanism clearly still functions despite the damage to the rest of its body. The Mangle also had motivation, if we can attribute such things to possessed animatronics. This character was tormented daily by children, pulled apart, and reassembled in ways that must have been tremendously disorienting for the spirit within. If any animatronic had reason to lash out, it was the Mangle, subjected to constant destruction without any hope of repair or peace. Location matters as well. The Mangle operated in Kids Cove, an area accessible to party guests. During a birthday celebration, children and adults alike would be moving through the restaurant, potentially entering the Mangle's territory. Other animatronics were restricted to stages or specific performance areas, but the mangle's broken state meant it might roam more freely. Finally, the aftermath suggests Mangle's guilt. All the toy animatronics were scrapped after the incident, but this makes particular sense if the mangle was responsible. The company wouldn't want to keep an animatronic that had just committed such a violent act, even in storage. Getting rid of all the toys could have been a way to destroy evidence, or simply to eliminate everything associated with the failed 1987 location. Toy Chica is the second most likely candidate, supported by cryptic hints that Scott Cawthon himself has dropped. The most significant is his question about the FNAF4 minigames. Why would the tiny toy Chica be missing her beak? This seems like a deliberate clue, directing attention to Toy Chica's removable beak as somehow relevant to the bite. In Ultimate Custom Night, Toy Chica has a voice line that directly addresses this. "Where's my beak?" Lodged in your forehead, of course. This is as close to a confession as we've gotten from any character. If taken at face value, it suggests Toy Chica attacked someone, driving her beak into their forehead with enough force to remove their frontal lobe. The size argument works both for and against Toy Chica. Some argue her beak is too small to cause the described injury, but others point out that removing a frontal lobe doesn't require a massive bite. A precise strike to the right location could accomplish the task, and Toy Chica's beak is certainly sharp enough to penetrate. Toy Chica was also definitely active during the events of FNAF 2 and would have been present during the birthday party. She was a performer, meant to interact with guests, giving her opportunity that some other animatronics lacked. Toy Bonnie and Toy Freddy are occasionally mentioned as suspects, though evidence for their involvement is weaker. Toy Bonnie has a large mouth and aggressive behavior patterns, but nothing specifically connects him to the bite. Toy Freddy, as the face of the franchise, might have caused the company to scrap the entire toy line if he was responsible, a kind of scorched earth response to their mascot committing violence. But this is speculation without strong support. The withered animatronics seem unlikely culprits despite their frightening appearances. Withered Freddy, withered Bonnie, withered Chica, and withered Foxy were stored in the parts and service room, away from areas where customers would be present. For them to have committed the bite, they would have needed to escape their storage area and navigate to wherever the party was happening. Withered Foxy has sometimes been proposed due to his long snout and broken jaw, features that might have been damaged during a bite, but his confinement to the back of the house makes his involvement improbable. The puppet is an interesting edge case. This animatronic was present at the 1987 location and is known to be possessed by Charlotte Emily's spirit. However, the puppet doesn't have a mouth in the traditional sense. Its mask-like face has no jaw mechanism that could bite in the way described. Unless the puppet attacked using some other method, it's hard to see how it could have removed someone's frontal lobe. The preponderance of evidence points to either the mangle or Toy Chica, with the mangle having the edge due to attack patterns, and the Toy Chica argument resting heavily on the cryptic hints and a voice line confession. It's possible Scott intended for both to be viable answers, leaving the mystery permanently ambiguous. Some theories suggest multiple animatronics were involved, with one initiating the attack and others joining in, or creating the chaos that allowed the bite to occur. In the confusion of a birthday party gone wrong, witnesses might not have clearly seen which animatronic actually committed the act. The uncertainty serves the narrative well. The bite of 87 remains frightening precisely because we can't point to a single culprit and say, that one is safe, that one is dangerous. Any of the animatronics could harbor the capacity for violence. Any of them might have been responsible for the most infamous injury in Fazbear entertainment history. This ambiguity reinforces the game's core message. These machines are not to be trusted, any of them, ever. Comparing the two bites, victims, perpetrators, and consequences. Now that we've examined both incidents in detail, let's bring them together for direct comparison. The bite of 83 and the bite of 87 share superficial similarity, both involving animatronic jaws closing on human victims, but the details reveal crucial differences that illuminate the evolution of both Fazbear Entertainment and the Five Nights at Freddy's narrative. The victims. The crying child, victim of the bite of 83, was a young boy, likely somewhere between 5 and 10 years old based on his proportions in the minigames. He was the son of William Afton, and making him part of the family at the center of Five Nights at Freddy's mythology. His death was the result of sustained psychological abuse culminating in a cruel prank, making it as much a story of human cruelty as mechanical danger. The victim of the bite of 87 was almost certainly an adult, most likely Jeremy Fitzgerald, based on the evidence we've discussed. This was an employee, not a family member of the company's founders, someone who had no particular connection to the animatronics beyond their job. Their injury was apparently unprovoked, at least in the immediate sense, a moment of mechanical malfunction or supernatural hostility, rather than the culmination of a specific campaign of torment. This difference in the victim profiles changes the emotional resonance of each incident. The bite of 83 feels like a tragedy of childhood, our innocence destroyed by those who should have protected it. The bite of 87 feels like workplace horror, the danger of jobs that put employees in harm's way without adequate protection or compensation. The perpetrators, Fredbear, committed the bite of 83, and this was clearly established by the minigames showing the incident. There's no ambiguity about which animatronic was responsible. Fredbear, the original golden bear, the mascot of Fredbear's family diner, bit down on a child's head and crushed his skull. The perpetrator of the bite of 87 remains uncertain, though the Mangle and Toy Chica are the leading candidates. This uncertainty itself is significant, reflecting the chaos of a restaurant with multiple animatronics, the confusion of witnesses, and perhaps deliberate obfuscation by Fazbear Entertainment trying to avoid liability. Fredbear was a spring-lock animatronic, operating in animatronic mode at the time of the incident. The toy animatronics were more advanced designs, equipped with facial recognition and more sophisticated AI. The technological differences didn't matter in the end. Both generations of machines proved capable of causing catastrophic injury. The mechanisms. The bite of 83 likely resulted from Fredbear's standard jaw animation activating while a child's head was inside his mouth. This wasn't a malfunction in the traditional sense. The animatronic did exactly what it was programmed to do. The problem was that something was in its jaws that shouldn't have been there. This makes the incident fundamentally preventable, a failure of human judgment rather than mechanical reliability. The bite of 87's mechanism is less clear. If the Mangle was responsible, the attack might have been deliberate. The animatronic's damaged programming or possessing spirit lashing out at a perceived threat. If Toy Chica committed the bite, her beak removing itself and being lodged in someone's forehead suggests a more violent, aggressive action than Fredbear's simple jaw closure. The FNAF4 bite was almost accidental. Tragic, horrifying, but not intentional on anyone's part. At least, not with lethal intent. Michael wanted to scare his brother, not kill him. The FNAF2 bite seems more predatory, the animatronic actively attacking rather than simply moving through a programmed cycle. The outcomes. The crying child died from his injuries. His skull was crushed, and despite possible time in a coma or hospital care, he didn't survive. His death contributed to William Afton's deteriorating mental state and Michael's lifelong guilt. The child's spirit may have persisted in some form, with various theories connecting him to Golden Freddy or other supernatural elements of the series. The bite of 87 victims survived, remarkably, without their frontal lobe. Phone Guy's amazement at this survival is well-founded. Frontal lobe damage typically causes severe personality changes, difficulty with speech and decision-making, and other significant impairments. Whoever survived this injury would never be the same person they were before, even if they technically continued living. The survival of the 87 victim actually makes that incident less emotionally impactful in some ways. We mourn the crying child because he died. His story ended by violence. The 87 victims' story continued, undamaged but persistent, and that continuation is left unexplored in the games. The consequences. The bite of 83 led to the closure of Fredbear's family diner, though the exact timeline is murky. The Springlock suits may have been phased out partly as a result, though other Springlock failures contributed to their discontinuation. Within the Afton family, the consequences were devastating. Michael's guilt, William's further descent into madness, and the general fragmentation of an already dysfunctional household. The bite of 87 had more visible public consequences. The animatronic's daytime free roaming was restricted across all Fazbear locations. The 1987 restaurant closed permanently. The toy animatronics were scrapped. And Fazbear Entertainment's reputation, already troubled by previous incidents, undertook another significant hit that would contribute to eventual bankruptcy. Both bites demonstrated that Fazbear Entertainment's business model was fundamentally unsafe. Animatronics designed to interact with humans could, under certain circumstances, cause catastrophic harm. The company's responses were always reactive, always insufficient, always more concerned with public relations than genuine safety reform. The narrative function. In the larger story of Five Nights at Freddy's, the two bites serve different purposes. The bite of 83 is deeply personal, a family tragedy that sets in motion character arcs spanning multiple games. The crying child's death isn't just a horrible incident. It's the seed from which much of the series' emotional weight grows. The bite of 87 is more institutional, representing the dangers of the company, rather than the specific dysfunction of the Afton family. It's referenced frequently as shorthand for why the animatronics are dangerous, why night security is necessary, why no one should trust these machines. Together, the bites establish that Five Nights at Freddy's operates in a world where terrible things happen regularly, where children die and adults are maimed, where entertainment technology masks genuine mortal peril. The existence of two separate bite incidents, 4 years apart, suggests this wasn't a freak occurrence, but a systemic problem that Fazbear Entertainment refused to adequately address. The lasting legacy and conclusion. As we come to the end of our exploration, let's consider what these two incidents mean for the broader Five Nights at Freddy's narrative, and why they continue to fascinate players nearly a decade after the first game's release. The bite of 83 and the bite of 87 represent different kinds of horror. The first is intimate, a tragedy that strikes within a family, caused by human cruelty as much as a mechanical danger. The second is impersonal, an occupational hazard turned lethal, a reminder that corporations will sacrifice employee safety for profit. Together, they establish that Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just about scary animatronics. It's about systems that fail, about negligence and its consequences, about how fun and entertainment can transform into trauma without warning. These incidents also demonstrate Scott Cawthon's skill as a storyteller. By revealing information gradually through cryptic phone calls and pixelated minigames and hidden Easter eggs, he created mysteries that the community could investigate together. The 83 versus 87 debate wasn't a flaw in the narrative. It was a feature, driving engagement and theorizing that kept the games relevant long after their initial release. The resolution of that debate, confirming two separate bytes, expanded the lore in satisfying ways. Instead of explaining away the 1983 date as a mistake or irrelevance, Scott had planned a second tragedy, an earlier incident that gave depth to the Afton family and established that Fazbear Entertainment's problems stretched back further than anyone realized. For the Afton family specifically, the Bite of 83 is foundational. Michael's character arc across multiple games, how his eventual alliance with the protagonists, his quest to undo the damage his family caused, all of this stems from the moment he shoved his brother into Fredbear's mouth. Without that birthday party, without that terrible prank, the Aftons might have remained merely dysfunctional rather than tragically cursed. William Afton's descent into serial murder was already underway by 1983, but losing his youngest son accelerated the process. His obsession with bringing people back from the dead, his experiments with remnant and possession, his willingness to sacrifice anyone, including his own children, for his goals, all of these intensified in the aftermath of his son's death. The crying child didn't just die in the Bite of 83. His death warped everyone around him into worse versions of themselves. The Bite of 87 had more institutional consequences. It changed how Fazbear Entertainment operated, establishing the restrictions on animatronic movement that would define future games. It contributed to the company's financial troubles and reputational damage, and it created a landmark event that characters reference as shorthand for the dangers these machines represent. Both bites also connect to the game's supernatural elements in interesting ways. The crying child spirit likely persists in some form, possibly possessing Golden Freddy or manifesting in other ways. The animatronics that committed the Bite of 87 were probably possessed as well. Spirits of murdered children lashing out at adults who reminded them of their killer. The violence wasn't purely mechanical. It was supernatural vengeance misdirected toward innocent targets. And this supernatural dimension adds moral complexity to the bites. Were the animatronics responsible for their actions, or were they vessels for spirits who had lost the ability to distinguish friend from foe? Is an animatronic that kills an innocent employee guilty? Or is it a victim itself, used as a weapon by forces beyond its control? These questions never received definitive answers, which is appropriate for a horror franchise built on ambiguity. As the Five Nights at Freddy's series has expanded through games, books, and now films, the two bites remain touchstones. They're referenced in later installments, used as examples in lore discussions, and depicted in fan content ranging from artwork to animation. A Markiplier's famous exclamation was that the Bite of 87 became a meme precisely because these incidents carry such weight in the community's imagination. The debates around these bites also showcase how passionate and dedicated the FNAF community has become. Thousands of forum posts, hundreds of theory videos, countless hours spent analyzing pixel art for hidden clues. All of this speaks to the depth of engagement that Scott Cawthon achieved. A lesser creator might have simply told players what happened. Scott trusted his audience to figure it out, and they rose to the challenge magnificently. Looking at the 2 bytes together, we see a pattern that extends throughout Five Nights at Freddy's. Bad things happen because systems fail, and people don't care enough to prevent them. The animatronics are dangerous because they were poorly designed, poorly maintained, and operated by a company more interested in profit than safety. The children die because adults like William Afton are monsters hiding in plain sight. The employees suffer because their jobs require them to face dangers that no minimum wage position should entail. This systemic critique makes Five Nights at Freddy's more than simple jump scare horror. It's a commentary on how institutions can cause harm through negligence, how entertainment industries exploit workers, how families can become vehicles for generational trauma. The bytes are the most visceral manifestations of these themes, moments when the abstract dangers become terrifyingly concrete. So what remains to be discovered about these incidents? Some details will likely stay ambiguous forever. Scott Cawthon has shown that he prefers mystery to certainty, suggestion to explicit statement. We may never know definitively which animatronic committed the bite of 87, or exactly what happened to the crying child's spirit after his death, or how Jeremy Fitzgerald spent his post-bite years. But the core stories are now clear. A child died at Fredbear's family diner in 1983, victim of his brother's cruelty and Fredbear's mechanical jaws. An adult was horrifically injured at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1987, losing their frontal lobe to a toy animatronic, but somehow surviving. 2 bytes, 4 years apart, representing the beginning and end of Fazbear Entertainment's most troubled era. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps these stories will linger in your mind. The clicking and whirring of mechanical jaws, the laughter of bullies turning to screams of horror, the cheerful music of children's birthday parties undercut by tragedy. These are the sounds that define Five Nights at Freddy's, and the 2 bytes are where they resonate most clearly. Thank you for joining me on this journey through some of the most pivotal moments in FNAF lore. If you've enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more content like this, diving deep into the stories that gaming has to offer. Let me know in the comments which bite you find more tragic, the death of the crying child in 83, or the survival without a frontal lobe in 87. There's something haunting about both outcomes, death being final, but survival being a different kind of horror, a life forever altered by a moment of mechanical violence. Until next time, rest well. Let the quiet of the night settle around you. And remember, in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, even the most innocent celebrations can turn deadly without warning. The animatronics are always watching, always moving, always capable of more than they appear. Good night. Deep Dive, the technology behind the danger. Before we proceed further into the specific incidents, it's worth taking a more detailed look at exactly how these animatronics functioned and why their design made catastrophic failures possible. Understanding the technology helps us understand why both bites occurred and why Fazbear Entertainment's response to each incident proved so inadequate. The animatronics of the Five Nights at Freddy's universe were remarkable achievements of engineering, at least on paper. They could move autonomously, respond to stimuli in their environment, perform coordinated shows, and even walk freely around their venues when not actively performing. This level of sophistication required complex systems working in harmony, servos for movement, sensors for environmental awareness, speakers for vocalization, and processors to coordinate it all. The early Springlock animatronics, like Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, were even more complex because they needed to accommodate two modes of operation. In animatronic mode, the internal mechanical systems were fully deployed, controlling the character's movements according to programmed routines. The endoskeleton sat within the suit's frame, connected to motors and actuators that gave the character its animation. In costume mode, all of that machinery had to compress against the inner walls of the suit, and creating a cavity large enough for a human adult to occupy. This compression was achieved through the springlock mechanism itself. Imagine a series of powerful springs attached to the endoskeleton components, normally pushing outward to hold the mechanical parts in their operational positions. When an employee needed to wear the suit, they would use a hand crank to compress these springs, physically pushing the endoskeleton against the suit's walls. Once compressed, small locks would engage to hold the springs in place, maintaining the cavity for the human performer. The problem was that these locks were delicate, designed more for convenience than for safety. They needed to be easy to release so that employees could quickly convert the suit back to animatronic mode when needed. But this ease of release meant they could also fail unexpectedly. The springs were under tremendous tension when compressed, constantly trying to push the endoskeleton back into its operational configuration. The locks were all that stood between a performer and a mechanical crushing. Moisture caused failures because it affected the friction between the lock components. A dry lock had enough grip to hold against the spring pressure. A wet lock, its surfaces lubricated by water or sweat or humidity, could slip just enough to release. And once one lock failed, the sudden movement often triggered cascading failures in adjacent locks, as the redistribution of forces exceeded what the remaining locks could hold. The training tapes described what happened next in disturbingly clinical terms. The freed springs would snap inward, bringing the endoskeleton components with them. Metal crossbeams, designed to support animatronic components, would pierce human flesh. Wire bundles that carried power and data throughout the animatronic would wrap around organs. Servo motors, still trying to execute programmed movements, would grind against bone. The victim would be impaled, crushed, and slowly destroyed from within as the suit reverted to its animatronic configuration with them trapped inside. Death from a springlock failure typically took minutes, not seconds. The initial impalement was often survivable, at least momentarily. But the continuing mechanical movement, the gradual crushing as servos activated and deactivated, the internal bleeding from dozens of puncture wounds, these accumulated until the body could no longer sustain life. Witnesses to springlock failures reported hearing victims try to speak, try to call for help, even as metal pushed through their vocal cords. This gruesome reality makes Fazbear Entertainment's continued use of springlock suits almost incomprehensible from a safety perspective. Multiple employees died in springlock failures, each death representing an obvious failure of the technology. Yet the suits remained in service for years, their cost-effectiveness apparently outweighing the occasional dead worker in management's calculations. The later animatronics, including those involved in the Bite of 87, used different technology. The toy animatronics had conventional endoskeletons that couldn't be compressed for costume use. They were always robots, never costumes. But they had their own dangers, and particularly in their facial recognition systems and free roaming capabilities. The facial recognition was designed as a safety feature, but it created unexpected problems. The systems were connected to criminal databases, theoretically allowing the animatronics to identify threats. But the recognition wasn't always accurate, and more importantly, the animatronics seemed to respond differently to different faces. Children's faces triggered friendly, engaging behaviors. Adult faces, particularly those the system didn't recognize, triggered different responses entirely. Phone Guy described this phenomenon in his Night 4 call during Five Nights at Freddy's 2. The animatronics interacted with kids just fine, he said. But when they encountered adults, they would just stare. The staring was unsettling, but it was the implication behind it that was truly disturbing. The animatronics saw adults as something other than friendly faces to engage with. They saw them as potential threats, or worse, as targets. This behavioral bifurcation may explain why the Bite of 87 victim was almost certainly an adult rather than a child. The animatronics were programmed, or possibly supernaturally influenced, to treat adults with suspicion or hostility. A child wandering too close to an animatronic would receive friendly attention. An adult doing the same thing might trigger an entirely different response. The free roaming mode added to the danger. The animatronics weren't confined to their stages during operating hours. They could walk through the restaurant, approaching tables and interacting with guests, and this was meant to enhance the entertainment experience, making the characters seem more alive and interactive. But it also meant the animatronics were mobile during the day, capable of moving to wherever they chose, including toward potential victims. When the Bite of 87 occurred, it happened during the day, during a birthday party, while the animatronics were in free roaming mode. The victim couldn't simply avoid the dangerous machine by staying away from the stage. The machine could come to them. And at some point during that party, one of them did exactly that. The minigame evidence. Reading between the pixels. The Five Nights at Freddy's series tells much of its story through minigames, simple 8-bit style sequences that play between nights or after completing certain tasks. These minigames are deliberately primitive in their graphics, are forcing players to interpret ambiguous imagery and fill in gaps with their own understanding. This approach has been both praised for its mysterious atmosphere and criticized for its deliberate obscurity. But for understanding the two bites, the minigames provide essential evidence that must be carefully analyzed. The FNAF 4 minigames show the crying child's final week in a series of short sequences. Each one advances the timeline by a day, while also revealing more about the child's circumstances and mental state. The graphics are intentionally limited, with characters represented by simple sprites and environments reduced to their essential elements. But within these limitations, crucial details emerge. The television Easter egg is perhaps the most important detail in the entire minigame sequence. In one scene, the crying child can interact with a TV in his house. When activated, the television displays images of the Fredbear and Friends show, featuring Fredbear, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy together. More importantly, the screen clearly displays the text 1983, establishing the year in which these events occur. For years, players debated whether this 1983 was the current year, or simply a copyright date for the show being displayed. After all, you might watch a rerun of a 1983 show in 1987 without any contradiction. But subsequent evidence, particularly the 1983 keypad code in Sister Location, confirmed that the minigames themselves take place in 1983, not 1987. The purple guy also appears in the FNAF4 minigames, briefly visible in a doorway helping someone into a spring Bonnie suit. And this detail connects the minigames to the broader narrative of William Afton's crimes, suggesting that even as the crying child's personal tragedy unfolds, his father continues perpetrating evil in the background. The presence of Purple Guy in a 1983 context also helps establish the timeline of Afton's murders, which extend across multiple years and locations. Other details in the minigames reinforce the 1983 setting. The animatronics visible are the original Springlock designs, Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, not the toy animatronics that would exist in 1987. The restaurant layout matches Fredbear's family diner, rather than the larger Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations. The absence of any toy animatronic imagery in a game that would later feature them prominently in FNAF2 suggests we're looking at an earlier era. The bite itself is depicted in the final minigame, after Night 5. The crying child's birthday party has begun at Fredbear's family diner. Michael and his masked friends corner the child, mock him, and then carry him toward the stage where Fredbear performs. They lift him up and thrust his head into Fredbear's open mouth, laughing at what they think is a harmless prank. The animatronic's jaw closes, the screen shakes, and the sequence ends. Subsequent minigames show the aftermath. The crying child lies in what appears to be a hospital setting, medical equipment visible nearby. His brother apologizes, voice flat with shock and guilt. The Fredbear plush speaks one final time, promising to put him back together. And then the child dies, his spirit presumably moving on to whatever afterlife or possession awaits in the FNAF universe. The minigames don't show the bite of 87 at all. That incident is referenced only through dialogue, primarily Phone Guy's calls in FNAF 1 and the setup in FNAF 2's Night 6 call. This absence is itself significant, suggesting that Scott Cawthon never intended to depict the 87 bite directly, preferring to leave it as a mystery that players could speculate about, rather than a depicted event. This approach created the confusion that spawned the 83 versus 87 debate. Players who expected to see the bite of 87 in FNAF 4 interpreted the minigames as depicting that famous incident, dismissing the 1983 date as irrelevant. Players who took the date seriously realized that we were seeing something different, an earlier tragedy that the community had never been told about. Both interpretations had supporting evidence, and the debate raged for years before Scott confirmed that the 83 interpretation was correct. The community investigation. How fans solved the mystery. The Five Nights at Freddy's community has always been remarkable for its dedication to solving the series' mysteries. From the first game's release, players dissected every frame of footage, every line of dialogue, every hidden image, searching for clues that would reveal the truth behind the horror. The 83 versus 87 debate was perhaps the greatest collaborative investigation the community had ever undertaken, spanning years and involving thousands of theorists across multiple platforms. The debate began almost immediately after FNAF 4's release. MatPat, the YouTuber behind Game Theory, released multiple videos arguing that the game depicted the bite of 87, pointing to the extensive marketing that had featured those numbers. Others pushed back, noting the 1983 television and the apparent setting at Fredbear's rather than Freddy's. Forum threads stretched for hundreds of pages as participants marshaled evidence for their preferred interpretation. The 87 camp had several strong arguments. Scott's pre-release marketing had heavily featured the numbers 8 and 7, including an famous image of Nightmare Foxy with 87 hidden in his eye. The game's teaser campaign seemed designed to build anticipation for finally seeing the bite of 87, an event that had been mysterious since the first game. And the general expectation was that FNAF 4 would provide answers about the franchise's most famous unsolved incident. The 83 camp countered with equally compelling evidence. The television date was explicit and deliberate, not something Scott would include accidentally. The setting was clearly Fredbear's family diner, which predated the 1987 location. The victim was a child, while Phone Guy's description of the 87 bite suggested an adult victim based on the workplace context. And most tellingly, the bite in FNAF4 resulted in death, while the 87 bite victim survived. The debate grew contentious at times, with both sides accusing the other of ignoring evidence or making unfounded assumptions. Some theorists changed positions multiple times as new evidence emerged or old evidence was reinterpreted. The uncertainty was frustrating for fans who wanted definitive answers, but it also kept the community engaged, constantly revisiting the games in search of overlooked details. The Sister Location's release in October 2016 provided the breakthrough that would eventually settle the debate. The game included a secret room accessible through specific gameplay choices, and in this room was a keypad. Players discovered that entering 1983 on this keypad would cause nearby monitors to display footage of a familiar bedroom, one that matched the crying child's room from FNAF 4's night sequences. This connection was crucial. It established that someone, presumably William Afton, had been monitoring the FNAF 4 bedroom in 1983. If the bedroom existed in 1983 and was being monitored in 1983, then the events taking place in that bedroom were almost certainly occurring in 1983 as well. The keypad code served as confirmation that the FNAF 4 setting was indeed 4 years before the bite of 87. As Scott Cawthon's own statements provided the final confirmation. In a November 2017 Reddit post, Scott addressed various fan theories and confirmed that game theory's interpretation of key events was correct. This included the acknowledgement that FNAF 4 took place in 1983 and depicted an incident separate from the bite of 87. The debate was officially settled. 2 bites had occurred, 4 years apart, each with its own victim and perpetrator. The resolution was satisfying for most fans, who appreciated having a definitive answer after years of uncertainty. But it also opened new questions. If the FNAF 4 bite was the bite of 83, then what exactly happened in the bite of 87? The earlier mystery had been solved, but the original mystery remained, now existing in contrast to its earlier counterpart rather than being explained by it. The aftermath. How each bite changed everything. The consequences of both bites extended far beyond their immediate victims. Each incident created ripples that affected the companies involved, the families touched by tragedy, and the broader narrative of the 5 Nights at Freddy's universe. Understanding these consequences helps us appreciate why these events matter so much to the overall story. The bite of 83 destroyed what remained of the Afton family's functionality. William Afton, already descending into criminal behavior, lost his youngest son to machines he had helped create. The guilt didn't reform him. If anything, it accelerated his descent into obsession with death and resurrection. His experiments with possession, his murders of children to study how spirits attach to animatronic bodies, his eventual transformation into Springtrap, all of this can be traced back to the trauma of losing his son and his desperate desire to understand how life might persist beyond death. Michael Afton's guilt was more constructive, in that it eventually led him toward redemption rather than further darkness, but that redemption would take decades to achieve. In the immediate aftermath of the bite, Michael presumably continued his troubled adolescence, perhaps attempting to suppress the memory of what he had done, perhaps tormented by it constantly. His later appearances in the franchise show a man driven to undo the damage his family had caused, a motivation that stems directly from his role in his brother's death. Elizabeth Afton's fate, while separate from the bite of 83, is nonetheless connected through family dysfunction. Her death at the hands of Circus Baby occurred in a household already marked by tragedy, where parental supervision was absent and warnings went unheeded. The loss of 2 children to animatronic incidents speaks to a fundamental failure in the Afton family, a pattern of negligence and obsession that made such tragedies almost inevitable. For Fazbear Entertainment, the bite of 83 likely contributed to the closure of Fredbear's family diner and the shift toward newer designs that moved away from springlock technology. The company's reputation, never particularly sterling, took another hit that would compound over time. Each incident added to the weight of liability and public relations damage that would eventually drive the company toward bankruptcy. The bite of 87 had more immediate and visible corporate consequences. The animatronics' free roaming mode during daytime hours was permanently restricted, a policy change that Phone Guy mentions in his very first call to the player in the original game. This restriction was a direct response to the bite, an acknowledgement that the animatronics were too dangerous to be allowed near guests without supervision. The toy animatronics were scrapped entirely, their advanced technology deemed too risky to continue using. This was a significant investment loss for the company, as the toys had been designed as a major upgrade from previous animatronic generations. Their facial recognition, sleeker designs, and more sophisticated movements represented substantial development costs that were now being written off. But the alternative, continuing to operate animatronics that had maimed a customer or employee, all was even more costly in terms of liability. The 1987 restaurant closed shortly after the bite, ending another chapter in Fazbear Entertainment's troubled history. The company would attempt to reopen eventually, salvaging some equipment and repurposing locations. But each closure added to the accumulating evidence that this business model was fundamentally flawed. Restaurants where children were hurt didn't attract families, no matter how entertaining the animatronics might be. Both bites also had supernatural consequences that are harder to trace, but equally significant. The crying child's spirit presumably persisted in some form, possibly possessing Golden Freddy, or manifesting in other ways within the FNAF universe. The animatronics that committed the bite of 87 were likely possessed by spirits of murdered children, and their attack on the victim possibly motivated by supernatural confusion rather than mechanical malfunction. These supernatural elements complicate the question of culpability, suggesting that the bites weren't simply accidents, but moments where supernatural forces acted through mechanical bodies. The victims remembered human cost of corporate negligence. It's easy, when discussing law and mechanics and corporate structures, to lose sight of the human cost represented by these incidents. The crying child and the bite of 87 victim weren't plot devices. They were, within the fiction, Real people whose lives were irrevocably changed or ended by Fazbear Entertainment's failures. The crying child spent his final days in terror, tormented by a brother who should have protected him, neglected by a father who should have been present, and surrounded by representations of the things he feared most. His birthday party should have been a moment of celebration, an occasion for family to gather and acknowledge another year of growth. Instead, it became the culmination of every fear he had ever experienced, his worst nightmare made literally real as his head was thrust into the jaws of the monster he had always known Fredbear to be. Whatever his real name, Evan or Chris or something else entirely, the crying child represents childhood vulnerability in its purest form. He couldn't protect himself from his brother's cruelty. He couldn't communicate his fears in ways that adults would take seriously. He couldn't escape the circumstances of his birth, growing up in the shadow of his father's dark enterprises. All he could do was cry, tears that marked him as weak in his family's eyes, but which were actually the only reasonable response to the horrors surrounding him. His death is the tragedy at the heart of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, the emotional core that makes the game's nightmare sequences meaningful beyond their jump scares. We're not just surviving attacks from scary animatronics. We're experiencing the dreams of a child whose reality was so terrifying that even his nightmares are simply extensions of his waking fears. Every mechanical nightmare that lunges from the darkness is a manifestation of the trauma that defined his short life. The bite of 87 victim is more anonymous, but no less tragic. Whether this was Jeremy Fitzgerald or someone else, this was a person who took a job expecting reasonable working conditions and instead lost part of their brain to an animatronic's jaws. They survived, which Phone Guy noted with amazement. But survival isn't the same as recovery. Life without a frontal lobe means dramatically altered personality, impaired judgment, difficulty with speech and social interaction. The victim who walked out of that restaurant, if they walked out at all, wasn't the same person who walked in. The fact that the victim survived makes the incident somewhat less tragic than the crying child's death, but also somewhat more horrifying. Death ends suffering. Survival without full faculties extends it indefinitely. Every day after the bite, the victim would face the consequences of that moment, struggling with cognitive tasks that others take for granted, are perhaps unable to work or maintain relationships, forever marked by what an animatronic did to them. These individual tragedies represent the true cost of Fazbear Entertainment's negligence. The company built dangerous machines, operated them in unsafe conditions, and consistently prioritized profits over safety. When people were hurt or killed, the company's response was to minimize publicity and shift blame rather than to fundamentally address the underlying dangers. Each victim was treated as an acceptable loss in the pursuit of entertainment revenue. Final reflections. What the 2 bites mean for FNAF. As we conclude our exploration of these pivotal incidents, we can step back and consider what they mean for the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise as a whole. These weren't just scary moments in a horror game. They were the defining tragedies that established the series' themes and set its events in motion. The bite of 83 and the bite of 87 together establish that the world of Five Nights at Freddy's is fundamentally unsafe. The animatronics aren't just creepy, they're genuinely dangerous, capable of causing severe injury or death under certain circumstances. This danger isn't supernatural alone, though possession adds to the threat. It's built into the technology itself, into machines designed without adequate safety considerations by a company that valued entertainment over human lives. These bites also establish the pattern of corporate negligence that runs throughout the franchise. Fazbear Entertainment knew its animatronics were dangerous. The training tapes for springlock suits explicitly prepared employees for death. The behavioral anomalies of the toy animatronics were known and documented. Yet the company continued operating, continued putting employees and guests in danger, until the accumulated incidents became impossible to ignore. The family tragedies represented by the bites ground the horror in human emotion. We're not just afraid of scary robots. We're mourning a child who died in terror and pitying a worker who was maimed on the job. The horror works because it's connected to recognizable human experiences of loss, guilt, and injustice. Michael Afton's guilt over his brother's death is something any sibling can understand, even if the specific circumstances are fantastical. Both bites have become cultural touchstones within the FNAF community. Our Markiplier's famous exclamation was that the bite of 87 became a meme precisely because these incidents carry such weight in fan consciousness. The debates they sparked, the theories they inspired, the countless hours of analysis they generated. All of this speaks to the community's engagement with the franchise's lore. These weren't just plot points. They were mysteries that fans felt invested in solving. The resolution of the 83 versus 87 debate demonstrated something important about how Scott Cawthon constructs his narratives. He trusts his audience to work through complex evidence, to debate interpretations, and to eventually arrive at the truth. The years of uncertainty weren't a failure of storytelling. They were a feature, keeping the community engaged and invested in ways that a straightforward revelation couldn't have achieved. And going forward, both bites continue to influence how new FNAF content is interpreted. Any animatronic jaw closing on screen invokes their memory. Any birthday party scene carries inherent tension. The games have established that these machines can and will hurt people, making every encounter with them fraught with potential danger. As you drift toward rest, let these stories settle into your mind. The crying child, alone at his birthday party, surrounded by people who should have loved him, but instead tormented him. The golden jaws of Fredbear, closing with mechanical indifference on a skull too fragile to withstand them. Jeremy Fitzgerald, or whoever it was, attending one last birthday party before losing a piece of themselves to an animatronic gone wrong. These are the images that define Five Nights at Freddy's, are the tragedies that make the horror meaningful. If you've enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more content like this, diving deep into the stories that gaming has to offer. And let me know in the comments what aspect of FNAF lore you'd like to explore next. There are so many more mysteries waiting in the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So many more stories that deserve to be told in the quiet hours of the night. Until next time, rest well. Let the darkness settle around you peacefully. And remember, in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, some machines are more dangerous than they appear, and some birthday parties should have been cancelled long before the cake was ever cut. Good night. Our appendix, a detailed timeline of both incidents for those who appreciate having events laid out in clear chronological order. Here is a comprehensive timeline that places both bites within the broader context of Five Nights at Freddy's history. Understanding when these events occurred relative to other incidents helps clarify their significance and their connections to the larger narrative. The story begins in the early 1980s, when Henry Emily and William Afton established their partnership and founded Fazbear Entertainment. Their first creation was Fredbear's Family Diner, a modest restaurant featuring Fredbear and Spring Bonnie as the primary attractions. These Springlock animatronics represented cutting-edge technology at the time, combining the appeal of costume performers with the consistency of robotic entertainment. The diner was successful enough to inspire expansion plans, though the inherent dangers of Springlock technology were already becoming apparent. By 1983, the Afton family had been shaped by William's growing darkness and neglect. Michael, the eldest son, had developed into a cruel teenager who found pleasure in tormenting his younger siblings. Elizabeth, the middle child, was developing her own fascination with animatronics that would later prove fatal. And the youngest, the crying child, lived in constant terror of the mechanical performers that surrounded his family's business. The bite of 83 occurred during a birthday party at Fredbear's family diner. The exact date isn't specified in the games, but it takes place after several days of escalating torment depicted in the FNAF4 mini-games. Michael and his friends, wearing masks of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, cornered the crying child at his own party. They lifted him toward Fredbear's stage and thrust his head into the animatronic's open jaws. Fredbear's mouth closed, crushing the child's skull in an instant of mechanical violence. The aftermath of the bite of 83 is shown in fragments. The crying child lies in what appears to be a hospital bed, his brother apologizing at his side. The Fredbear plush delivers its cryptic promise to put him back together. And then the child dies, his short life ending before it truly began. The exact gap between the bite and his death isn't specified, but it appears to be relatively brief, perhaps hours or days rather than weeks. Fredbear's family diner likely closed at some point after the bite of 83, though the exact timing is uncertain, and the Springlock suits were eventually phased out across all Fazbear Entertainment locations, following multiple incidents that demonstrated their danger. Phone Guy's training tapes, recorded sometime during this transition period, describe the decision to decommission the Springlock suits after multiple and simultaneous Springlock failures at a sister location. The years between 1983 and 1987 saw Fazbear Entertainment evolving its business model. New animatronic designs moved away from Springlock technology, using conventional endoskeletons that couldn't be worn as costumes. New characters joined the roster, and new locations opened, though each seemed to accumulate its own share of incidents and closure. William Afton's murders continued during this period, actually with children disappearing from Fazbear Entertainment locations and their spirits possessing animatronics. By 1987, the company had opened a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, featuring the toy animatronics. These were the most advanced designs yet, incorporating facial recognition technology and more sophisticated behavioral programming. The withered animatronics, salvaged from previous locations, were stored in the parts and service room, kept around for their parts rather than their performance capabilities. The mangle, originally designed as Toy Foxy, had been damaged so frequently by children that staff gave up repairing it, leaving it as a take apart and put back together attraction. November 1987 marked the beginning of the end for this location. Jeremy Fitzgerald worked the night shift and, guided by Phone Guy's calls, through increasingly dangerous encounters with the animatronics. The robots were behaving strangely, particularly toward adult staff, and someone had been tampering with their programming. The restaurant was closing down, its brief operation ending in another chapter of Fazbear Entertainment's troubled history. The bite of 87 occurred on the final day of the restaurant's operation, during a birthday party that Jeremy Fitzgerald had been assigned to supervise. He was told to stay close to the animatronics and make sure they didn't hurt anyone. The irony of this instruction would become apparent when one of those animatronics, likely the Mangle or Toy Chica, based on available evidence, bit him or another person, removing the victim's frontal lobe in an attack that left them permanently altered. The aftermath of the bite of 87 included the scrapping of all toy animatronics, the permanent restriction of animatronic free roaming during daytime hours, and another closure for another Fazbear entertainment location. The victim survived remarkably, living without the portion of their brain that governs personality, judgment, and social behavior. Their subsequent life isn't documented in the games, leaving their fate as another mystery in a franchise full of them. These two bites, occurring 4 years apart, bracket one of the most dangerous periods in Fazbear Entertainment's history. Between them, children were murdered, animatronics were possessed, and a serial killer continued his work under the cover of costume characters. The bites aren't isolated incidents, they're symptoms of a company whose fundamental business model put people in danger for the sake of entertainment. The cultural impact. How two fictional incidents captivated millions. Five Nights at Freddy's has become a cultural phenomenon, spawning multiple games, novels, a feature film, countless merchandise items, and one of the most dedicated fan communities in gaming history. At the center of this phenomenon are the two bites, incidents that captured the imagination of players and theorists in ways that few video game plot points ever have. The appeal of the bites lies partly in their mystery. The bite of 87 was mentioned in the first game's very first phone call, establishing early that something terrible had happened at Freddy's. Players were given just enough information to be intrigued. The bite occurred. The victim survived without their frontal lobe, and as a result, the animatronic's daytime movement was restricted. Everything else was left to imagination and investigation. When FNAF 4 seemed to depict a bite, the community naturally assumed this was the payoff they had been waiting for. The marketing had pointed to 87, the teasers had featured those numbers, and the game delivered a bite in its climactic minigame. The confusion that followed when players noticed the 1983 date and began debating whether this was really the famous incident kept engagement high long after the game's release. This debate became a community-wide event, with players across platforms arguing their interpretations and searching for evidence to support their positions. The uncertainty wasn't frustrating, it was energizing. Every new discovery, every reinterpreted detail, every confirmation or contradiction kept the conversation going. The bites weren't just plot points, they were puzzles that the community could solve together. YouTube theorists built substantial audiences discussing the bites and their implications. Game Theory's videos on the topic accumulated millions of views, with MatPat's analysis helping shape how the broader gaming community understood the incidents. Other theorists offered alternative interpretations, creating a robust ecosystem of content around what were ultimately brief scenes in indie horror games. The meme culture around the bites, particularly Markiplier's famous "Was that the bite of 87?" reaction, extended the incident's reach beyond the dedicated FNAF community. People who had never played the games knew about the bite of 87 from memes and references, making it one of the most famous pieces of video game lore, despite its relatively minimal in-game depiction. The eventual resolution of the debate, confirming two separate bites, was satisfying because it validated the community's investigation. The 1983 date wasn't a mistake or a red herring. It was a genuine clue that careful observers had correctly identified. Scott Cawthon had trusted his audience to work through the evidence, and they had risen to the challenge. This collaborative process of discovery is part of what makes FNAF storytelling so engaging. Looking forward, the bites in context of continuing FNAF lore. As the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise continues to expand through new games, novels, and other media, thus the 2 bites remain foundational events that inform how new content is understood. Any new animatronic is potentially dangerous in the same way that Fredbear and the toy animatronics proved dangerous. Any new corporate entity in the franchise is potentially negligent in the same way that Fazbear Entertainment was negligent. The precedent established by the bite shapes expectations for the entire fictional universe. The FNAF movie, released in 2023, drew on the franchise's established lore without directly depicting either bite. This restraint was likely intentional, preserving these moments for possible future adaptation, while focusing on other aspects of the story. When and if a second film does address the bites, it will need to handle them carefully, balancing fan expectations against the constraints of live-action filmmaking. Future games will likely continue referencing the bites as touchstones of the franchise's history. Security Breach and its DLC already draw on established lore, and any subsequent entries will need to acknowledge the events that shape the world they're depicting. The bites aren't just backstory, they're defining moments that explain why the FNAF universe operates the way it does. For fans, the bites serve as entry points into the broader lore. Someone encountering FNAF for the first time might hear about the bite of 87 and be intrigued enough to investigate further. The incidents are dramatic enough to capture attention and complex enough to reward deeper exploration. They function as hooks that draw people into the larger mystery of what happened at Freddy's. The community that formed around solving these mysteries continues to analyze new content with the same rigor applied to the original debates. Every new game, every new book, every new piece of official content is examined for clues about continuing storylines and unresolved questions. The bites established the expectation that FNAF content rewards careful attention, and the community has internalized that lesson thoroughly. Closing thoughts on 2 tragedies. The bite of 83 and the bite of 87 represent different facets of horror. The first is intimate and familial, a tragedy that occurs within a dysfunctional household and involves a child whose death was largely caused by those who should have loved him. The second is institutional and anonymous, a workplace injury that resulted from corporate negligence and mechanical danger. Together, they establish that Five Nights at Freddy's contains both personal horror and systemic horror, both the terror of what family members can do to each other and the terror of what institutions can do to individuals. These incidents aren't gratuitously violent. They're meaningful within the narrative. The crying child's death drives Michael Afton's redemption arc, gives weight to the Fredbear imagery throughout the series, and establishes the pattern of children being harmed by animatronics that continues through the franchise. The bite of 87 victim survival creates the policy changes that define how animatronics operate in subsequent games, explains why night security exists at all, and provides the original mystery that drew many players into the lore. Understanding these bites means understanding Five Nights at Freddy's at its most fundamental level. They're not just scary moments in scary games. They're the events that created the scary world in the first place. Every possessed animatronic, every night shift survival, every corporate cover-up connects back to these foundational tragedies. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive exploration of the Bite of 83 and the Bite of 87. These incidents deserve the detailed attention they've received from the community, and I hope this analysis has helped clarify their significance while also conveying the emotional weight they carry. In a franchise full of jump scares and supernatural horror, the most disturbing moments remain these all too human tragedies. A child killed by his brother's cruelty, a worker maimed by a company's negligence. Remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this content, and leave a comment sharing your own thoughts on these pivotal events. Whether you're a longtime fan who lived through the 83 versus 87 debates, or a newcomer just discovering the depths of FNAF lore, there's always more to explore in the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Rest now. Let the night carry you toward peaceful dreams. And remember that somewhere, in fictional restaurants that have captured the imagination of millions, golden bears and broken foxes stand in darkness, waiting for someone to remember what they did and what was done to them. Good night. A note on sources and continued investigation for those who wish to explore these incidents further. The primary sources remain the games themselves. Our Five Nights at Freddy's 4's minigames contain the most direct depiction of the Bite of 83, while Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and 2 provide the dialogue references that establish the Bite of 87. Sister Location's keypad Easter egg provided crucial confirmation of the timeline, and Scott Cawthon's Reddit comments have clarified various disputed points. The novel trilogy, while considered parallel to the game universe, rather than directly canonical, offers additional perspective on Springlock technology and the Afton family. The Silver Eyes, the Twisted Ones, and the Fourth Closet expand on themes present in the games while telling their own distinct story. The Fazbear Fright short story collections provide further exploration of concepts like remnant, possession, and the various ways animatronics can harm humans, and the community's ongoing investigation means that new details continue to emerge. Each new game release prompts re-examination of previous events, and dedicated fans regularly uncover overlooked clues that deepen our understanding. The FNAF Wiki provides comprehensive documentation of evidence and theories, while Reddit communities continue active discussion of lore questions both solved and unsolved. What makes Five Nights at Freddy's special as a franchise is exactly this depth of engagement. The bites aren't just plot points to be consumed and forgotten. They're mysteries to be investigated, debates to be had, connections to be drawn. The community that has formed around this investigation represents one of gaming's most impressive collaborative analytical efforts, and the bites stand at the center of that effort. Whether you're researching for your own theories, creating content about the franchise, or simply enjoying the lore as a spectator, remember that these fictional tragedies have resonated with millions of people precisely because they touch on real fears and real emotions. The horror of a child dying at his own birthday party, the horror of a worker being maimed by company equipment. These are fears that transcend the specific fictional context of FNAF. They're why the bites matter beyond their narrative function, why they've captured so much attention and generated so much analysis. As you rest tonight, perhaps some small part of your mind will continue processing these stories. That's the mark of effective horror. It doesn't end when the game closes or the video stops. It lingers, raising questions, prompting reflections, and making you wonder what other secrets might be hiding in the shadows of places that were supposed to bring only joy. The animatronics are waiting. They've been waiting since 1983, since 1987, through all the years between and all the years since. They'll keep waiting, their metal jaws ready, their mechanical eyes tracking movement, their programming running the same loops it always has. And somewhere in that programming, in those possessed circuits and haunted servos, are the echoes of every tragedy that ever occurred within their gleaming chrome shells. Sweet dreams. The story of the two bites is ultimately a story about consequences. The consequences of dangerous technology deployed without adequate safeguards. The consequences of family dysfunction allowed to fester without intervention. The consequences of corporate negligence prioritizing profits over human safety. The consequences of cruelty, even when the perpetrator didn't intend for things to go so far. Every element that contributed to both bites was avoidable. Better engineering could have made the animatronics safer. Better parenting could have prevented Michael's bullying from reaching its tragic conclusion. Better corporate policies could have restricted animatronic access during parties. Better everything, really. But better didn't happen, and two people paid the price. One with his life, one with a piece of his brain. That's the true horror of Five Nights at Freddy's. Not the jump scares, not the supernatural possessions, but the mundane failures that made the extraordinary tragedies possible. The bites were preventable. They happened anyway. And in that gap between what could have been prevented and what actually occurred lies the darkest truth of Fazbear Entertainment's legacy. May your own nights be free of such failures. May the mechanical beings in your world, whatever forms they take, remain safely under human control. And may no birthday party you ever attend end the way that poor child's party ended in 1983. Rest well. The morning will come soon enough